Okay, guys. So a lot of people have been asking me essentially, what's the deal with the Ponzi scheme? Everybody knows how it works. I'll give you the quick walkthrough. I've got an article here from Jim Probasco, published December 13th, 2022. What's interesting about this is the history of it. But what's more interesting is essentially what is the largest, like the biggest out of all of them, Ponzi schemes that exists in America. Now, as you know, Ponzi schemes are illegal, right? I mean, you can shape in certain ways so that they're potentially in gray room, but for the most part, they're illegal unless the government, unless the government creates them, fosters them, grows them, etc. Right? But no, it's not always fair, So that's all right. So here we go. Patrick Hardy, howdy. Rosalind Thompson, howdy, howdy. So let's go through this thing real quick. I want you guys to fully understand how Ponzi schemes work, who started them, all that stuff. All right. So there's this guy named Charles Ponzi. And obviously, he had a pyramid scheme, which is basically, it's a scam in which money from a constant stream of new investments is used to pay off earlier investors while simultaneously enriching the scheme's creator. Okay. All right. Getting a kickback. And that's what Charles Ponzi, essentially was able to pull off. And what he used was this exchange rate stamp situation between countries. Bottom line was he was an innovator. Maybe not the first guy to come up with this stuff, but bottom line was he was an innovator, and it was so big, people were just like, damn, we're going to call this the Ponzi scheme. So he, in 1920, raked in an estimated 15 million in an 8-month period, which today is around 220 million. So we're not talking small here. We're talking Ponzi went big by persuading thousands of Bostonians that he could make them rich in a relatively short period of time. Ultimately, Ponzi, our wonderful, gentleman here, good old Charles, was essentially deported from the United States. And he tried to do this like whole, ferrying thing, airline thing. He tried to be, a teacher of English and French. He did the interpreter thing, and ultimately he died pretty much broke January 18th, 1949 in a charity hospital in Brazil. Now, what's interesting about this is that if you pay attention to the date, the year that this happened, of this Ponzi scheme, yeah, Robert Wolf, this is live. We're live right now. So what's interesting about this, what's so funny about this is if you focus on that year, 1920. Now that, is essentially right around the time of 1917. Now we're going to go back to that date. Just hold that in your mind. Hold that number in your mind, 1917. So Charles Ponzi just made 15 million back then, worth $220 million nowadays in 1920. Okay, but remember, we're going to come back to 3 years earlier in essentially 1917. All right, cool. All right, now we got it. Now you guys know that Social Security benefits, the whole idea is that the next generation, right, the next investors pay for the earlier investors. Classic Ponzi scheme. Retirement, Ponzi scheme. Disability benefits, Ponzi scheme. Widows benefits, Ponzi scheme. Disabled adult child benefits, Ponzi scheme. Right? They're all part of a Ponzi scheme. Okay. Now, as you know, this Ponzi scheme, which I think is massive, the Social Security one, it is big. It is big, but it's not the biggest. Now let's rank these things so we've got a full understanding on the timeline of what we're dealing with here, okay? So Ponzi, the original, the Charles Ponzi, we're talking 15 million back in the day, worth about 220 million today, okay? Here are some notable alternatives to keep in mind that are like more recent. 2016 to 2018, BitConnect's cryptocurrency investment program scam ended with a market capitalization of $2.6 billion. 2012, Alan Stanford conducted a Ponzi scheme through his Stanford International Bank that scammed investors out of $7 billion. 2008, Tom Peters stole $3.65 billion through his firm Petters Co. Inc. 2008, one everybody knows, Bernie Madoff, former chairman of the NASDAQ stock exchange, former chairman of the NASDAQ stock exchange, scammed investors out of $65 billion, making it the biggest Ponzi scheme in history. So they say in this article. I have proof otherwise. 1994 to 2003, so we're talking major one here. Mutual Benefits Co. conned 28,000 terminally ill people out of $1 billion in one of the most egregious Ponzi schemes of all time, right? This is from that article, all right? So Ponzi schemes are evil. They're terrible. They place the burden of the future of, being able to afford, being able to fix on this group of people, this new investing group that maybe they can pull it off, maybe they can't. You know what I mean? Maybe they can, maybe they can't. Your retirement is literally sitting in the hands of millennials. I just to give you that. So, all right. So now we know that's some Ponzi schemes. But keep in mind, August 14th, 1935, Social Security Administration put in place whole idea retirement, right? Okay. Future generations will pay for the older generation, right? It's a Ponzi scheme. Very simple, very clear. The government did it, made it valid. 1935. Now, is this essentially, realistically here, the largest Ponzi scheme? I thought it was. I really did. I really genuinely sat back and I was like, you know what? This has got to be it. It has to be it. Yeah, I was wrong. It's not it. Amount at the beginning of the reporting of the reported year, specifically from the ssa.gov/policy/trust-funds-summary.html, little number sign table, little hashtag table, right? So specifically from, I'll read you the research statistics and policy analysis summary of actuarial status of the Social Security Trust Funds 2021. Whoa, T-Paw. Whoa. That's crazy. Wow. T-Paw just donated $100. That's amazing. That's incredible. Holy cannoli. Wow, T-Paw. Thank you. And you got to catch up with me too about that thing we talked about. So in 2021, that's a crazy amount. Thank you, T-Paw. So in 2021, the amount at the beginning of the reported year, right? So at the beginning of the year where they report what's going on in billions is 2,908, but it's really in trillions. So that's 2.908 trillion in these trust funds, right? And there's the OASDI. There's the DI, there's the OASI, there's the Medicaid trust. So there's all these little trust funds that are part of Social Security benefits, right? And they had 2.908 trillion sitting in the bank at the beginning of 2021. 2022, this is a lesser number because remember, trust funds are sucking air right now. They're not doing so great. 2.852 trillion. Now remember, these other numbers we were talking about, Bernie, Madoff, we're talking billions. But Social Security, government-based Ponzi scheme, is at almost 3 trillion of a game. Now, I thought, and I really genuinely believe, like, this was it. This was the ultimate. There is no other Ponzi. This was the biggest Ponzi scheme I believed on earth, right? Because, I mean, think about it. There's a lot of Americans, this is a clear, obvious Ponzi scheme. I thought that was it. It's not. The biggest Ponzi scheme on earth, which obviously is American. That's why we're doing a video on it. Remember how we talked about essentially this idea of, 1917. So in 1917, what happened, and we're talking about Woodrow Wilson here. That's who we're talking about. Like that was the president during that time. That's who we're focusing on right now. Okay, so Woodrow Wilson was sitting there in the Congress, and they were looking at this thing called the debt ceiling. And this is relevant because we're about to have a pissy match between Republicans and Democrats over raising the debt ceiling, where the government on the 19th, like a couple of days ago, ran out of money. But what's crazy about this is that I started to look into the debt ceiling, all the stuff, how it works, all that stuff. Now, the debt ceiling is right now based off of www.pgpf.org and also usdebtclock.org, is around 31, I'm just going to summarize, $0.5 trillion. $31.5 trillion. Okay. Now, keep in mind, Social Security, we're talking like 3 trillion. National debt, 31.5 trillion. So here's the deal. What is national debt? Well, national debt exists as a result of us being able to borrow money against the average American, right? The average citizen. And currently, at the rates as we are, each American has debt against them, debt sitting on their shoulders from government mismanagement of around $94,300. So just to keep that in mind, blah, blah, blah. So what they're looking at is, this whole thing. And I've seen the articles, I've seen the things where they're talking about, hey, I saw the upping thing too. So, I see the whole passing and everything's, but here's my argument here. And remember, we don't have all the full details, or at least I didn't get them yet because this is all very new. It might be a temporary, it might be a bigger thing because sometimes they don't raise it enough, but I have to see what all the figures are on it for the raised amount. But the bottom line is this. When it comes to this debt limit, what's happening now is that we owe a debt as Americans to pay off. But most people, obviously, will never pay off this debt. They won't. So they are relying on future generations of Americans to pay into the system, right? To create gross domestic product that the country can borrow against. So think about that for a moment. So, okay, imagine your generation can't afford, like those who are retired at this point. They're not going to be working at that level. Wow, thank you. RiseShock 4, again, $10 donation. That's amazing. T-Paw, again, $100 donation. It's just absolutely, absolutely incredible. That's absolutely incredible. And let's see, Wanda Greer says, please enter this to settle a discussion. If someone getting SSA, Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP benefits obtains a loan, is this considered reportable income? You would report the loan, but that's not income. A loan isn't income. It's money you owe back. So no, that would not be traditional income. Okay, so what's funny here is, and Liberty kind of really hit it, but it actually goes way back. So Liberty's saying, oh, from 2008. It's not. It's actually all the way back, right? All the way back to much earlier times. And the crazy part about it is that the retired who were these original debts were borrowed against their heads, they can't pay off the debt. So now we rely on future investors, if you will, future citizens who are going to work, pay taxes to pay off the debt that we have in this debt ceiling problem. So what's amazing is that the truth of this whole thing is that the largest Ponzi scheme in the history of the human race, which just happens to be with America, is actually our national debt and not Social Security benefits. Compared to Social Security benefits, the original Charles Ponzi, Bernie Madoff, some of these, Bitcoin-related disasters, they're small. They're small. But Social Security, all the money that's in the trust funds that everybody is paid over their life is minuscule compared to essentially this massive $31.5 trillion debt that they have sitting on our heads. I don't have a solution for how they're going to fix that. And we both know that they're going through this game where they bump it up a little, bump it up a little, bump it up a little to cover things. And then they talk about, well, we might have to, reduce pensions paid to the politicians. Or we might have to, take some money from here in this agency, slide it over there, or sell some old military gear, or sell off some, bonds, whatever. The point is this: America is in the most fragile position it's ever been. Coming out of World War II, we were in a great position. But after that point, it got really out of control. And so the crazy, and I know Howling Moon, it is beyond depressing, but it's nothing that like any of us can really control at this point. The politicians can't control it. They really can't. Think about it. And I hear you. Cincinnati Fireball, I get it. Like losing the gold standard was the beginning of the end. True. But like the gold standard, no matter what, always fails because you're at some point not going to have enough gold to cover what this country would require. As we had more babies and more kids and more of this, the numbers kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Sure, they were real quick to get off the gold standard before they needed to. Sure, nobody's arguing that. But the thing is, the gold standard would always fail because we still had to have like the elements present in some bank account in some vault somewhere, right? So what's interesting about it is that going forward, we are stuck in a perpetual lock, which means that if we don't raise the limit, then we can't pay for stuff that the government has to do. And if we do pay it, we're constantly just putting more debt on the shoulders of Americans that we owe to somebody, whether it be China or super rich people or whatever. So what's happening at this point is we can't really balance the budget because the politicians all want their thing, and that's like anything, each one of these politicians, each one of them, like all the senators, all the House reps, they're like their own little CEO. They're like their own little thing, and they've all built, their little statues as to what their thing is about. And when their thing doesn't get funded, they're very unhappy. And some of them share things, right? And some of them have things that are just their thing for their particular state. So what's crazy about this whole thing is that the future of this country is that it either massively continues to grow, which ironically requires significant amounts of refugees and immigrants and things like that. But then that's off balanced by a heavy chunk of those individuals being capable of going on to SSI benefits, which directly draws out of our general taxes. And if you read through what the Secretary was talking about, they're literally sitting there wondering how many tax dollars are going to be coming in over the next 6 months. Imagine that. Your politicians, the highest level executives that report to the president, right, are sitting there worried because they don't know how much money is going to come in. And think about that. Once again, what we're like employees that produce, right? So let me give you an example. Let's say each and every human being in America that, makes income that the government can borrow against. Let's just simplify it. Let's say everybody makes widgets and they all sell widgets and they're like their own little company. It's just easier to think of it that way. When everybody's like their own little company and they make widgets, whatever. They're different widgets. There's a market for them. People are buying them from overseas, whatever, right? People are buying them from each other, whatever. So what's crazy about this is that we as these widget creators or we as these farm animals are what the government borrows against. But they borrowed so much against our, ability to produce things, right? To make sales happen, to sell stuff, that now when we go ahead and sell stuff, they can't borrow against us anymore because what we make per year is not enough for other countries to believe that this country could pay off a debt. It's like somebody, for example, wanting to buy a house, right? So they go and try to get a mortgage, and the mortgage company, they look at, what the person's making each year, and they're like, if you could just make another $1,000 a month, we could cover you. But since you can't, we won't cover you. But that's exactly what's happening here. We all as Americans aren't making as much as they need so that they can keep borrowing more. Now, here's the funny thing with this whole thing. When it comes to essentially the United States debt ceiling, there's constitutional backing. There's specific terminology related to it. Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution, only Congress can authorize the borrowing of money on the credit of the United States. Right? Sounds like getting a bank loan, right? Because that's exactly what it is. From the founding of the U.S. until 1970, Congress directly authorized each debt issued. Okay, this is all from Wikipedia, simple stuff. To provide more flexibility to finance the United States involvement in World War I, Congress modified the method by which it authorized debt in the Second Liberty Bond Act of 1917. 1917. Remember how we were talking about that? Under this act, Congress established an aggregate limit or ceiling on the total amount of new bonds that could be issued. Now, there's arguments against this whole thing, right? Against this whole being able to have a limit or being able to, constantly borrow against it. The 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution states the validity of the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned. Okay, many scholars argue that this clause means that it is unconstitutional for the United States to default on its debt. If this were to be true, right, then there's no legal basis for the United States government to default on its public debt, even if this would mean that its spending would exceed the limits set through the debt ceiling law. Now, here's the funny part. The debt ceiling, right, is as a thought, as an idea, as a concept, is just basically a line in the sand. But the line in the sand now has reached the capacity of our ability to make stuff that other countries believe they can, use as collateral. Our ability to go ahead and make enough, sell enough, and then the U.S. looks at all of us and says, we're going to borrow against you for your benefit. Maybe, maybe for your benefit. So what's interesting about this, and this is the final notation here, and again, thank you guys so much for the donation. It was just absolutely, T-Paw was just massive. And Ryshock 4, again, thank you. That's just incredible. So here's the thing that I just want to keep in mind here. So remember how I said you had Charles Ponzi in 1920, right? Doing this scam, this scheme. Well, he's the one essentially where, like they labeled this whole pyramid scheme after him. But where does the debt ceiling and the capacity to borrow against the American people, but where does the debt ceiling come from? Well, the debt ceiling, right, limiting essentially the government's, the politicians' ability to borrow against our work product. When does that come from? In like the timeline of things? Well, shit, that's the funniest part of this. The debt ceiling comes from 1917 when they passed that. So before Ponzi even really did his true, Bach, this is a great musical composition of like how he did the great Ponzi scheme. Before that was recognized for what it was in 1920. Before that, Congress enabled the Ponzi scheme going back to 1917. And then you can even take it back farther to when Congress was able to go ahead and start to borrow against different entities or even the people of the United States. So the origin, of this whole thing is the government. The government is actually the mass creator of the Ponzi scheme, at least in this country and those actors that were a part of this country. Charles Ponzi, came after the government was doing it. And ironically, they evicted him from the country. That's just what's so funny. They can do these things, but people who do it, right, get kicked out of America. So my point to you on this is that, Constitution is created, we have borrowing against the people, borrowing against interest in the United States, taking on debt, which is very early on. Some of the earliest debt taken on was literally, President Washington. So the craziest part about this, and the reason why they took on debt, was that it validated the United States. When other countries will give you money, right, during war times or whatever, it validates the existence of the United States. It's like saying, okay, we believe that you are a country. We believe that you could potentially pay us back. We will give you this money to do your war games or whatever. So that was the reason for it. But what's crazy about this thing, which I just think is just mind-blowing, is that the United States, for all U.S. purposes, was the original creator of the Ponzi scheme way before Charles Ponzi did his thing in 1920. Now, you would think the U.S. would learn from this and not abuse it. No, 1935 came around, right? 1935 came around, and what did the government do? Social Security benefits, a new Ponzi scheme, right? And what's so interesting about that is that, August 14th, 1935, right? That's we had Roosevelt at that point. So what you see the government doing is that they learn from their ability to borrow against the American people. Ponzi did it. He got evicted from the country. They kicked his butt out. They said, no. You made 15 million, illegally, worth 220 million. You're out. They kicked him out. Then the government turned around basically 15 years later and said, we've got an idea. A mega Ponzi scheme. And maybe it makes sense, right? Maybe if you take it for what its face value is, that the government having the capacity to go ahead and create these massive Ponzi schemes that just, ad infinitum on forever. Because, what's going to outlive a person, right? Right? A country is going to outlive a person. Companies outlive people. Countries, outlive people. Maybe it could work. It could just continue to, Ponzi scheme its way through the history of, generation after generation of human beings that are born. Maybe that's a safer bet. But if it was such a safe bet, I'm going to end on this point. If it was such a safe bet, then why have we abused the national debt to the point where they can no longer borrow against the American people because we don't make enough for other countries to believe that we, the American people, could pay them back? Or even consider the more recent one, the 1935 creation, Social Security benefits, right? Modified in 1950s, disability, 1970s, SSI, the more modern creations, right? We look at the trust fund accounts, and those are failing because, let's call it like it is. The Ponzi scheme isn't working. So at some point, we've got to sit back and say, okay, Ponzi schemes don't work. They don't work for private citizens. They don't work for companies, right? The Bernie Madoffs. And they don't work for governments either. They don't. Because if it worked for the government, right, we wouldn't have any national debt on behalf of the American people. We just wouldn't have it. If it worked for the government, right, we wouldn't have Social Security trust funds failing, right? So my point to you is the study of these Ponzi schemes is just absolutely incredible because you see a government getting just obnoxiously greedy. I mean, and when you think about that, you think about how much is owed on your head. Because remember, if you're sitting there, you're like, I'm debt free. You're not. I mean, if you move to another country and then, change your citizenship to that other country that had no debt on that human person, on their civilians, then yeah, you could become debt free. But in America, you're $94,300 in debt to China, to other nations, to super wealthy families, etc. That's craziness. That's just mind-boggling. So, guys, I'll catch you a little bit later. You have a wonderful, wonderful night. I hope we'll catch up on some more interesting topics in the not-too-distant future, and we will go from there. Thank you so much. And again, T-Paw, massive, massive donation. I want to also do a little shout-out to RyShock4 for the $10 donation. Really appreciate it. Teapot, $100 donation, just massive. So I will catch you guys a little bit later. You have a wonderful night, and we will go from there. Thanks so much, guys. Bye-bye, guys. Bye-bye.